Hello and welcome to the West Asia Post. I'm your host Ghadi Francis, and this is our weekly show, which is your window to one of the world's most volatile regions. Just a reminder, West Asia is the Gulf region, Iran, Turkey, Mesopotamia, and the Levantine Mediterranean coast. It's a big area. Before we dive into this week's news reports and updates from this region, let's take a look at the headlines.
Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu to travel to Turkey next week, hold talks with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and discuss the Israel-Palestine escalation, among other topics. 3 people killed in an Israeli attack on the Syrian capital. Monitors say the strikes targeted warehouses used by the Hezbollah group. Influential Shiite leader and former Prime Minister Muqtada al-Sadr calls for the meetings of the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to show support for Islam after Sweden says Quran can be burnt as part of free speech during protests.
Starting with Turkey and Erdogan. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, just weeks after his toughest electoral battle, embarks on a Gulf tour. His aim is to attract investments to Turkey that is already reeling from economic distress. Will he be successful? Here's a report.
This week, Recep Tayyip Erdogan wrapped up a quick tour of major Gulf nations. The Turkish president went to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, seeking foreign investment. This was his first big tour since the May election. Erdogan first landed in Jeddah, stopping over at the Al Salam Palace. The Turkish stalwart discussed foreign investments and defense purchases with Mohammed bin Salman. In between the two photo ops, the Turkish president signed the country's biggest defense contract in history. Under the deal, Saudi will acquire battle-tested drones produced by Turkey's Baykar. The kingdom signed the deal with the aim of enhancing the readiness of its armed forces and bolstering its defense and manufacturing capabilities. Next on the list was Qatar. Erdogan was greeted by Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani at the Lusail Palace. The two leaders held bilateral talks. The delegations marked 50 years of establishing ties. There was a big display of friendship, which came half a decade after announcing rivalries. The last stop and the most crucial was UAE. The president, along with his wife and a 200-member-strong business delegation, met senior Emirati officials in Abu Dhabi.
To begin with, I welcome you, my brother, Your Excellency, in your second home, the UAE, and I express my immense happiness to meet you again.
He met with President Mohammed bin Zayed. The two countries signed several deals estimated to be worth $50.7 billion. They include an extradition accord, deals in energy and natural resources development, space and defense cooperation. Abu Dhabi was Erdogan's last stop in the Gulf tour. Ankara has recently reconciled with its Gulf neighbors. This includes the UAE and Saudi Arabia. It fell out with the regional heavyweights after the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings. Ankara's support for the Muslim Brotherhood was considered a threat by some Gulf monarchies. Turkey's denouncing of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman during the 2018 Khashoggi killing only made matters worse. But this reignited diplomacy does not come as a surprise. Because you see, in the world of power, opportunism comes handy. The same MBS who Erdogan once called a murderer now becomes a pal. As the two, ride together in an electric car. Turkey is in need of foreign investors. They want hedge funds and FDI to prop up its foreign reserves, which currently fall under the humble zero. The Turkish currency has shed more than 90% of its value in the last decade. Erdogan's unorthodox economic policies have served as cherry on the cake, which was already getting ruined by the heated inflation. But what are these Gulf nations getting from the deal? Power, diversification, and tested technology. Gulf Arab countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, have launched ambitious plans to diversify their economies away from oil and have looked to Turkey for help in developing local industries. The right example here is the drone deal between Saudi Arabia and Turkey that includes joint production.
Now let's go to the boiling Israeli politics. Israelis have returned back to the streets. They are continuing their protests against Netanyahu's government renewal of the judicial overhaul. From reservists to cyberware officials, all are standing in defiance as the reform row threatens their domestic stability. Here's a report.
Israel stands at a critical juncture, a moment that will go down in history as a make or break for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his ultra-conservative coalition. From Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, thousands are on the streets. They are protesting controversial judicial reforms. This week, the Israeli Parliamentary Committee adopted a key clause of the reform.
התקבלה ותועבר לוועדת החוקה, חוק ומשפט שאותה יציג.
It would limit the reasonability clause that allows the judiciary to strike down government decisions. The bill now goes for its second and third readings as it continues on its path to become a law. Leading the resistance is Israel's reservist force. More than 10,000 reservist soldiers, including members of the elite intelligence unit 8200 and Air Force pilots, have signed an online petition to go to war for the soul of the nation. They threaten to boycott their reservist duty if the bill goes further.
We do not agree with the government's judicial overhaul, and we will not allow a dictatorship to happen. We will only serve under a democracy.
We will not serve under dictator leadership. Israel is a democracy. We'll serve Israel only if it's a Jewish democracy, liberal country.
The country's military establishment has also pushed back against the protesters. Army Chief Herzel Halevi warned that anyone who calls for not reporting to reserve duty harms the Israeli forces and the security of the state. The seeping of the constitutional disputes into the military has jarred Israelis. It was long seen as an apolitical melting pot for a fractious society. Among the dissenters is Nadav Argaman, the former head of Shin Bet, the internal security agency of Israel. He leveled withering criticism at Netanyahu and accused Netanyahu of preserving his ruling coalition of ultra-nationalist and ultra-orthodox parties, not the state itself. He expressed worries that Israel might be on the verge of a civil war. The protests in Israel have made news across the world. Its longtime ally, the US, has urged on the coalition to hit the brakes with its overhaul. And this week, the Israeli president was in Washington when the protesters flared up. When asked about the tensions back home, he called the heated discussions a proof of Israeli democracy.
In practice, the intense debate going on back home, even as we speak, is the clearest tribute to the fortitude of Israel's democracy. Israel's democracy has always been based on free and fair elections, on honoring the people's choice, on safeguarding minority rights, on protection of human and civil liberties, and on a strong and independent judiciary.
Netanyahu introduced the reform soon after taking office last year. The judicial overhaul plan has divided an already highly polarized country and sparked months of sustained mass protests. The government froze the bill in March this year after weeks of protests and mounting labor strikes. But recently, the judicial overhaul was rebooted after talks seeking compromise with opposition lawmakers failed. Proponents of the changes say the court has become too interventionist and that the change will facilitate effective governance. Opponents say the court has a critical role in protecting civil rights and liberties. Netanyahu is currently on trial for corruption. He heads the country's most ultra-nationalist and religiously conservative government in Israel's 75-year history.
"2023 looks quite eventful for Syria. It all started with Arab rapprochement, reopening consulates, boosting diplomatic ties. Now, in this recent week, Iraqi head of state met with President Assad. The Iraqi-Syrian relations are not new. They have been vital. They share a very long borderline and even wars. But this recent visit was impactful in its own sense. We tell you how.
The Prime Minister of Iraq, Mohammad Shia al-Sudani, traveled to Damascus this week on a two-day diplomatic trip. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad welcomed al-Sudani and his delegation with military honors. Iraq was among the few countries that maintained ties with Syria after the civil war broke out. But no country had stepped into Damascus for over a decade. This is the first visit by an Iraqi leader since 2011. The two discussed a range of issues in the high-stakes talks, including the security of their shared 600-kilometer-long border and mitigating the impact of drought. The leaders also agreed to enhance cooperation to reduce drug smuggling.
We also discussed the issue of drugs, which is currently the most dangerous problem, and it is no different than terrorism. Drugs can destroy society the same way terrorism can in any society. I and the Prime Minister discussed lots of topics.
Sudani supported lifting of sanctions on Syria. The sanctions were imposed on Damascus when it descended into a civil war more than a decade ago.
Iraq supports the measures to lift sanctions against Syria, to protect the interests of the Syrian people and help them get assistance and necessities, thus alleviating the humanitarian issues by solving the problem of daily material shortages.
Baghdad and Damascus maintain close economic, military and political ties with regional heavyweight Iran. The three have been pally to one another through the unrest. Al-Sudani also reiterated Iraq's support for Syrian control over the entire nation. Back in 2014, both countries fell victim to the Islamic State. The terror group took control of large swaths of land in Iraq and Syria. After a years-long campaign that left tens of thousands dead in both countries, the Islamic State was defeated in Iraq in 2017 and in March 2019 in Syria. Over the past years, Damascus's forces regained control of much of Syria with the help of Russia and Iran. The terror group no longer controls any territory, but it carries out frequently deadly attacks in the region.
We are facing some specific and direct challenges, and on top of these challenges, there is also terrorism and cooperation in fighting terrorism, which is active and alive and won't die.
The visit comes at a significant time for Syria. Starting from Saudi Arabia, West Asian nations have started embracing Damascus once again. Syria was suspended from the Arab League in 2011. What followed was decades of tensions. Assad waited it out. He was readmitted to the Arab League this May. As part of the re-entry, the Syrian government has agreed to crack down on cross-border drug trafficking and the return of millions of refugees. The government has pledged action but maintains it is not involved in capital trafficking.
Famous for the worst reasons, Iran's morality police is back in the spotlight. This time the officials made it official. They're talking about the hijab once again. But this law seems to be a little different. We tell you how.
Pages of the calendar slowly turn as guarded policemen reappear in Iranian squares, hawking from the sides. Their job is to ensure women and men are sticking to the country's legally abiding dress code. Once again, the focus is the headscarf known as the hijab. Iran's state media has announced the return of the morality police. 10 months after the death of Mahsa Amini, the officials now resume patrols to make women comply with strict Islamic codes.
The police have no choice but to, starting today, deploy both motor and foot patrols across the country to give warnings to these women who unfortunately paid no attention to the consequences of unconventional attire and insist on breaking the norms. Should they fail to comply with police orders, they will be confronted legally and be referred to the judiciary.
The Gasht-e-Irshad, or guidance patrols in English, are special police units tasked with ensuring the respect of Islamic morals. They detain people who are perceived to be improperly dressed. The Iranian law is based on their interpretation of the Sharia. Under this, women are obligated to cover their heads with a headscarf and wear loose-fitted long clothes so as to disguise their figures. In September 2022, Iran descended into chaos. Thousands were on the streets venting out against the morality police and senior ruling clerics of the Islamic Republic. The resistance was triggered by a now infamous incident: the death of a 22-year-old Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini. Amini was arrested by the morality police for a reason as trivial as her hair showing from the headscarf. 3 days after detention, she died. The police claim an unknown disease behind her death, while her family accuses officials of killing Amini while in the re-education center. Her death triggered months-long protests, where morality police were visibly absent from the streets. The government instead deployed alternate means to ensure that the rules are followed. These included the closure of businesses whose staff did not conform to the rules and installing cameras in public places to track down offenders. Moral police are now back, and so is the Iranian rebellion.
They cannot impose it like before. The number of people who do not obey is too high now. They cannot handle all of us. The last thing they can do is use violence and force against us. They cannot do it.
Hijab was not always a compulsory item of clothing in Iranian culture. Women wore them actively, but because they considered it a part of their identity, their beliefs and their culture, not because of a mandate. Wearing a headscarf became compulsory for Iranian women after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. They have been protesting against the dress code for years now. But there is another facet to it that is hardly discussed. It does not take into consideration the different forms of dresses worn by Iran's various ethnic and religious groups. For years, authorities have promoted the black chador, a large piece of cloth that only leaves the face exposed. Iran is a mixed society. It has Persians, Kurds, Arabs, and Turkmens, to mention just some sections. Each of these groups have their traditional clothing. Their scarves differ in the way they look and the way they are worn. The resistance is not so much about the hijab. but about how the government is enforcing it. It is the combined frustration against the Islamic Republic, people's protest for a democracy, and against the clerics. It is a fight for their rights that only starts at the headscarf.
In Jordan, there's a dish that is very iconic, very well known, very delicious, al-mansaf. But there's one thing about mansaf, you might really feel sleepy after having it. So a restaurant in Amman considered this concept. You can have your mansaf and then lay down for the nap. Here's a report.
Yogurt-covered meat, cooked in dollops butter and oil, served over a bed of fragrant rice. This is mansaf, the national dish of Jordan. A Levantine dish the country enjoys, but often in the comfort of their homes. The reason? The rich mansaf makes a person so drowsy that all they can think of is a nap. This Jordanian restaurant has come to their rescue. They offer a bed, an air conditioner and quiet to their customers. All this after they have devoured the heavy meal.
The idea started as a joke. Jamid yogurt, traditional ghee and meat in preparing mansaf. These are heavy ingredients, so most people like to have a nap after eating mansaf because ingredients are heavy and it is a heavy meal for the body.
It all started when some customers joked about getting a place to crash and soon turned into one of its kind eat and lay down concept that the Muab restaurant offers in the Jordanian capital of Amman.
This is not the first time I have come here. It is a new idea, but sometimes there are some people, including me, who get disconnected when they eat mansaf. For those who accepted the idea, they can just rest. The idea is excellent.
Mansaf is naturally a very heavy meal in Jordan, and it is important for one to have a nap, sleep after eating mansaf. Why? Because mansaf shakes the mind, so one has to sleep. If he did not sleep, then there should be something wrong with the mansaf.
Mansaf is consumed on a bread in Jordan. It has been celebrated for decades. It even finds a mention on UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage list.
That's all we have for you on this episode of the West Asia Post. I will see you next week with a brand new lineup, always bringing you the fresh stories, news, updates from one of the most volatile regions in the world. Until then, you stay safe. I am Ghadi Francis signing off from the heart of Beirut, Lebanon. And you're watching WION World is One.